In 1933, a widow in Chicago stood at a cast iron stove and turned scraps into a dinner that kept her family alive. Today, a Manhattan restaurant charges $30 for a dish they cannot replicate. That meal is the 14th on this list. The 8th meal cost exactly 3 cents to make. The first is a dessert made without a single piece of fruit, baked in absolute desperation. These 25 forgotten meals were designed for pure survival. They fed people at kitchen tables that used to seat 6, while bread lines stretched around city blocks. Hit that subscribe button. The 25th survival meal born from this era was the bean sandwich. When families had absolutely nothing left in the pantry, they learned how to stretch Friday supper into Monday lunch. Leftover cooked beans were pulled from the icebox and mashed into a heavy, dense paste with the back of a wooden spoon. Mothers scraped this thick spread heavily across cheap white bread. If the backyard dirt garden was still producing, a thin slice of tomato and a single leaf of lettuce were added. The bread was folded over, wrapped tightly, and carried to the factory lines or the dusty schoolyards. The sandwich cost perhaps 3 to 5 pennies. It was heavy in the stomach, and it kept exhausted working men standing during long, unforgiving factory shifts. This identical logic of total utilization created the 24th meal on our list, crackling bread. When every single penny mattered for survival, absolutely nothing from an animal was ever thrown away. After the women rendered pork fat in massive iron kettles to make pure lard for winter storage, they were left with crispy, fried skin and tissue in the bottom of the pot. These salty byproducts were called cracklings. They scraped every last piece out, mixed them straight into coarse cornmeal with a splash of water, and baked the heavy dough flat on a black, greased cookie sheet. It was eaten as a daily bread substitute when wheat flour was simply too expensive for a rural family to buy. At roughly 3 cents a batch, it provided massive, cheap calories to survive. Today, boutique grocery stores sell fried pork skins in artisanal bags for premium prices. But your grandmother just called it surviving the winter. A similar need for cheap, portable fuel led to the 23rd meal. In the working-class neighborhoods of Ohio in 1932, a hot lunch was a luxury that few employed men could afford. A single can of commercially packed pork and beans cost exactly 5 cents at the local corner grocer. Men would take that single tin, open it on a busy job site or while sitting on a cracked sidewalk curb, and spoon the cold, sweet beans directly between 2 cheap slices of bread. 1 nickel for the can and a couple of pennies for the bread equaled a massive, filling meal. It fueled an entire afternoon of brutal physical labor. It was never considered a glamorous or polite meal. It was fuel. You ate it fast and you went back to work. A 7-cent lunch kept a man on his feet. Today, modern delis charge $14 for sandwiches with half the protein. The 22nd meal originated with German and Jewish immigrant families arriving in American cities. They quickly learned how to make empty kitchen cabinets feel completely full. When the week wages ran out before Thursday, mothers took the last few cheap white potatoes from the cellar and grated them down to the very nubs. They scraped their knuckles against the tin graters, mixing the wet potato shreds with a single precious egg, a handful of flour, and coarse salt. They dropped the heavy batter into a pan of smoking hot grease. The edges crisped up dark and jagged against the iron, while the inside stayed hot, soft, and incredibly dense. At 5 cents a serving, it was a masterpiece of poverty. The heavy smell of frying onions filled the tenement halls, turning 3 lonely potatoes into a feast. The 21st meal offered a rare escape from this grim reality. During the hardest years of the Great Depression, children still begged their exhausted mothers for something sweet. With local bakeries closed and sugar treated like gold, mothers took a plain slice of white bread, scraped a microscopic layer of butter across the rough surface, and sprinkled it generously with raw white sugar. If the family was doing exceptionally well that month, a dash of cinnamon was added to the top. The bread was toasted in the wood stove until the sugar melted into a sticky glaze, or it was simply handed to the child raw on the back porch. It cost roughly 2 cents to make. For wealthy kids living safely across town, this was merely a simple afternoon snack. For the poor children of the era, it was the only dessert they ever knew. This was arithmetic. This was the lingering taste of a stolen American childhood. The 20th meal was a localized variation of egg drop soup. This was not the rich dish you find in modern takeout boxes. In the cramped kitchens of immigrant Chicago, a single egg was a luxury. Mothers brought a small pot of watered-down broth to a rolling boil over a coal stove. They took 1 precious egg, beat it in a chipped ceramic bowl, and streamed it slowly into the churning water until it ribboned out thin and pale. They scraped the very last drop from the bowl. This hot, salty liquid was poured directly over hard, stale bread that was too tough to chew, but too valuable to throw away. Clara Canucciari made this exact meal in her Depression-era kitchen, tricking a starving stomach into feeling completely full. The 19th meal was cabbage soup. The sharp, heavy smell of boiling cabbage defined the hallways of American tenement buildings for an entire decade. Cabbage was dirt cheap and stored for months without rotting. Women took a single heavy head, chopped it roughly, and dropped it into a massive iron pot with a few potatoes and whatever onions were left. If the family had a lucky week, a small chunk of salt pork was thrown in for flavor. It simmered for hours until the cabbage broke down into soft, translucent ribbons. You ate a bowl, and then you ate another. It went a long way, and it kept you alive. The 18th meal cornbread in Buttermilk served a different regional purpose. Deep in the Appalachian hollows and across the rural South, this was not just a snack, it was Daddy's supper. Men came home from the fields or the factory lines so deeply exhausted they could barely speak. Wives took dry, leftover cornbread from the morning, crumbled it straight into a heavy glass tumbler, and poured thick, cold buttermilk right over the top. Buttermilk was the liquid left behind after churning butter, meaning it cost absolutely nothing. The bread soaked up the sour milk until it became a dense, heavy mush eaten with a long spoon. It required no fire. It required no chewing. It just provided instant, necessary calories to a broken man. When sickness struck these same families, medical care was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For the poor, survival meant treating the sick at home with whatever sat in the cupboard. When elderly grandparents lost their teeth and could no longer chew, or when children burned with fever, mothers made milk toast. Rough slices of bread were scorched dark over an open flame, placed in a deep bowl, and drowned in scalding hot milk. A tiny scraping of butter melted over the top, pooling yellow against the white milk. Sometimes a pinch of sugar or salt was added. It was soft, warm, and easily swallowed. It was the ultimate comfort food of pure desperation. While milk toast provided sustenance for the sick, healthy children required cheap, dense calories. In the 1930s, eggs were scarce, and commercial yeast was incredibly expensive to buy. But peanut butter cost exactly 10 cents a pound, making it a miracle protein. American mothers figured out how to bake a heavy, dense loaf of bread using nothing but flour, milk, sugar, baking powder, and a massive scoop of thick peanut butter. There were no eggs, no yeast, and no rising time required. They stirred the sticky, heavy batter with wooden spoons until their arms ached, poured it into dented tin loaf pans, and baked it until the crust cracked. A single slice sat like a brick in a hungry child's stomach. It tasted rich, and it felt safe. Today, modern bakeries completely ignore it. Baking without basic ingredients extended to dessert as well. In the rural Midwest and deep Appalachian mountains, fresh fruit was an impossible luxury. When local lemons were entirely unavailable or far too expensive for a farmer's coin, housewives faced an empty dessert table. They solved the problem with a brutal, brilliant substitution. They mixed harsh, cheap vinegar directly into white sugar, cracked in a few eggs, added butter, and poured the strange liquid straight into a pale pie crust. The oven heat transformed the harsh acid. The vinegar perfectly mimicked the sharp, bright bite of expensive lemon. It was an absolute illusion baked into a tin pan. Men ate it and never knew the difference. When even cheap sugar and vinegar ran out, families relied on the absolute last defense against true starvation. In Ohio, in 1932, a massive 10-pound sack of white potatoes cost exactly 19 cents. Women stood over iron stoves and brought a large pot of salted water to a heavy boil. They dropped in peeled, rough-chopped potatoes and whatever onions they could scavenge from the cellar. They stirred the water slow. To thicken the broth, they took a wooden spoon and smashed the soft potatoes directly against the cast iron walls of the pot. They poured in a splash of milk only if the farm still had a producing cow. When there was absolutely nothing else left in the world, there were potatoes. Today, modern restaurant chains add a handful of bacon and cheese to your grandmother's desperate survival recipe and charge $9 a bowl. While rural families stretched potatoes, working-class households in the cities adopted military survival tactics. The men who returned from military service brought a dark, heavy habit home, and their families adopted it immediately. The veterans had a very colorful, profane name for it, calling it SOS on a shingle. American mothers kept the name clean for the dinner table. They melted a knob of butter, whisked in raw flour and milk until it turned into a heavy, thick white sauce, and dropped in thin ribbons of intensely salty dried beef. They poured this boiling, creamy gravy straight over dry, burnt toast. The heavily preserved, salty meat flavored absolutely everything it touched. The thick gravy turned 2 meager slices of dried beef into a massive, heavy feast that kept 6 people full until morning. For immigrant communities, survival tactics meant returning to the staples of their homeland. For the Italian-American immigrants crowded into city tenements, this was never a choice. Clara Canucciari's family ate this meal on heavy rotation because their pantry was entirely empty. Mothers took a handful of cheap dried pasta, dumped in canned or dried beans, and stretched the entire pot using nothing but heavy crushed garlic and cheap olive oil. They ate it night after night until the phrase pasta fazool literally became street slang for cheap, poor food. You ate it because it was all you could afford. You survived on it. Today, Olive Garden and upscale Italian restaurants print pasta e fagioli in fancy script and charge $14 for that exact same peasant bowl. This desperation extended far beyond the city tenements. Across America, displaced families and broken men lived in sprawling, desperate shanty towns that they bitterly named Hoovervilles. There was no single recipe for this meal. Every single version was different, dictated entirely by whatever scraps a man could scavenge that day. Over open, smoking campfires, they boiled rough macaroni in a single black pot, dumped in whatever bruised canned tomatoes they could find, and sliced in a few cheap hot dogs to flavor the gray water. Eating it was both basic sustenance and a quiet, furious political protest against a president they blamed for their misery. One single, cheap hot dog could flavor an entire pot of boiling water and feed 12 starving people. Today, a single hot dog at an American baseball park costs $7. While transient men boiled scraps in shantytowns, established households stretched their pennies with dry legumes. In 1933, a massive pot of dried navy beans simmering with a cheap ham bone fed an entire family for up to 3 days. It cost roughly 5 to 7 cents to make. The bone itself became the flavor for the next 3 meals. It was a true lifesaver for the American working class, highly nutritious and incredibly cheap. This exact humble recipe has been served continuously in the United States Senate dining room since at least 1903. Your grandmother soaked those beans overnight and served them in a chipped bowl to keep her children from starving. Today, modern food writers rediscovered it. They gave it a fancy name. Now, a bowl of white bean cassoulet at a French bistro costs $18. While some households stretched bones into days of soup, the 9th meal on our list proved that no mother ever had the luxury of wasting a single crumb. When the bread became entirely too stale for sandwiches, it was considered far too precious to toss. Women cubed the hard, stale bread and dropped it directly into a pot of simmering broth or water, tossing in whatever bruised onions or vegetables they could scavenge. The stale bread dissolved slowly, thickening the hot water into a heavy, dense stew. Every culture facing empty shelves discovered this precise arithmetic. The Pennsylvania Dutch called it brown soup, and Italian immigrants called it ribollita. Today, Manhattan restaurants print that Italian name on fine paper menus and charge $18 a bowl. Your grandmother just called it supper. The 8th dish relied on one of the very few crops that remained incredibly cheap and plentiful across the desperate American landscape. Corn was transformed into fried mush. For roughly 3 cents, mothers boiled a simple pot of coarse cornmeal, water, and coarse salt until it thickened into a heavy paste. They poured it flat, let it set completely cold, and sliced it into thick planks. These heavy yellow squares were dropped into a cast iron skillet with a knob of rendered lard and fried hard until the edges turned dark and crispy. It was one of the most common breakfasts eaten by the working class, consumed strictly out of necessity. Today, celebrity chefs pan-sear it, call it polenta, and charge $16 a plate. Your grandfather called it mush, and it cost less than a nickel. The 7th survival recipe was born from pioneer wagons heading west through brutal, apple-free territories, carrying the earliest versions of a total culinary illusion. By the 1930s, the recipe for mock apple pie was printed directly onto the back of Ritz cracker boxes. When American families could not afford fresh fruit, mothers boiled cheap crackers in a heavy sugar syrup, adding cream of tartar and a squeeze of lemon juice. Through sheer chemical reaction, it perfectly mimicked the sharp taste and soft texture of real baked apples, while containing exactly 0 apples. It was the ultimate food deception crafted from empty pantries. Between 2020 and 2023, this desperate survival recipe went massively viral on TikTok for a new generation facing grocery inflation. They thought it was a clever modern trick, but it was actually a 90-year-old ghost. The 6th meal was a staple for families who were entirely out of options. Clara Canucciari grew up in Chicago, eating pasta with peas night after night, as her mother constantly rotated the empty pantry. The nightly rotation consisted of pasta with peas, pasta with beans, or pasta with heavy garlic. Women took cheap dry pasta, a few canned peas, an onion, a rough potato, and a splash of olive oil. They sautéed the potato and onion, dumped in the peas, and stirred it through the hot noodles. Clara lived to be 98 years old on this diet, surviving the Great Depression on a 10-cent bowl of noodles. Today, pasta e piselli is a $15 signature dish at upscale Italian restaurants. Clara's mother just called it Tuesday. When the grocery money completely vanished, American women created the fifth meal by simply walking out the back door and looking at the dirt. Children were sent into the yards with small tin buckets to gather handfuls of wild dandelion greens straight from the earth. They foraged for free because they had absolutely no other choice. They carried these rough weeds into the kitchen and boiled them violently 3 separate times just to kill the harsh, bitter taste. Mothers tossed the limp greens with sharp vinegar, and whatever leftover bacon drippings remained in the tin cup by the stove. It was entirely free, yet it was rich in iron and vital vitamins, helping countless families survive severe malnutrition when the pantries ran completely dry. It was survival food pulled directly from the ground. Today, Whole Foods packages those exact same weeds in crisp plastic containers, labels them organic microgreens, and charges $6 a bag. Your grandmother just called them dinner. The fourth dish taught an entire generation how to keep their dignity intact while eating on mere pennies. Clara Canucciari's Italian-American mother would slice heavy white potatoes and whatever cheap onions she had, frying them slow in a single cast iron skillet until they turned dark and golden. She would drop in cheap sliced hot dogs, or whatever scrap meat was available, letting the fat coat the hot potatoes. The smell of frying onions and rendered meat fat filled the small Chicago tenement, masking the reality of their poverty. She fed her entire family from that one pan in 15 minutes, and they sat at the table profoundly grateful. The entire meal cost less than a dime in the 1930s. Today, trendy brunch spots serve rustic potato hash with artisan sausage and charge $16 a plate. Clara just called it the poor man's meal. Even in the darkest, most desperate depths of the Depression, mothers absolutely refused to let a child's birthday pass without some small sliver of joy, leading to the third recipe. When they had absolutely no eggs, no butter, and no milk to their name, they performed a quiet kitchen adaptation. Also known as depression cake or war cake, it required only the barest essentials. They mixed plain flour, sugar, and cheap cocoa powder directly in the ungreased baking pan, making 3 small wells in the dry dirt. They poured in water, vegetable oil, and harsh vinegar, requiring no mixing bowl at all. The vinegar reacted violently with the baking soda, forcing the heavy, wet batter to rise without a single expensive egg. Children sitting at those worn tables didn't know it was a poor cake. It was just chocolate cake, and it was wonderful. Today, modern bakery chains charge $35 to $50 for a whole chocolate cake. This desperate, eggless version cost roughly 10 cents. The second meal on the list is the one that old men and women still cry over when asked to remember their childhoods. Universal across all poor American communities, bread and lard was documented in countless WPA oral histories as the ultimate final line of defense against absolute starvation. A heavy loaf of bread cost 5 to 7 cents, and pure rendered lard cost exactly 15 cents a pound in Wisconsin in 1935. Mothers took a rough slice of bread and scraped a heavy, thick layer of pure, cold animal fat straight across the top. Sometimes they sprinkled a tiny pinch of harsh salt or sugar over it if they were incredibly lucky. That was it. That was the entire dinner. It meant the family had absolutely nothing else left to their name, but at least they had this. The generation who ate this daily is dying, and the memory of their quiet shame is dying with them. Today, upscale restaurants spread whipped duck fat on artisan bread and charge a $9 cover for the appetizer. The final survival recipe was known as water pie, or desperation pie, when American farm families had absolutely nothing left, not a single bruised apple, not a single wild berry. They baked a dessert out of thin air. Women took a plain pie crust and poured cold, raw water directly into the empty shell. They heavily sweetened that water with white sugar, dusted it with cheap flour, added whatever drops of vanilla remained in the jar, and dotted the surface with tiny, precious squares of butter. That was it. They slid a tin pan of literal water into a hot wood stove. Through sheer heat and desperation, the ingredients bound together, transforming into a thick, rich, custard-like filling. The entire dessert cost roughly 6 to 8 cents to make. During the Great Depression, community church suppers anchored rural American society, and you brought a dish, no matter what. These water pies sat silently on long wooden tables right alongside proper fruit pies. Nobody ever admitted which family brought the water pie. Pride has limits, but every child got dessert, and that is what mattered. Today, a single slice of custard tart costs up to $7 at a modern bakery. Your grandmother made hers from tap water. She fed her children from an empty pantry and kept their dignity entirely intact. This was arithmetic. This was survival.